Welcome back. After the lunch break, we will do our best to stay on time.
Tell me your name.
Oh, right. I'm Agustin Fuentes, and I will be introducing the next speaker. We are quite lucky indeed to have Professor Douglas Fry, docent in cross-cultural developmental psychology at Åbo Academy, Finland. Hopefully I came close. It's not Åbo, it's Åbo. And an adjunct research scientist at the Bureau of Applied Research in Anthropology, University of Arizona. Dr. Fry is author of the books Beyond War and the Human Potential for Peace, and co-editor of Keeping the Peace, Conflict Resolution in Peaceful Societies Around the World, and Cultural Variation in Conflict Resolution, Alternatives to Violence. And he's also the associate editor of the Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace, and Conflict, associate editor on some journals, and author of a number of excellent journal articles. Just by way of context, I would like to credit Doug Fry with actually influencing me heavily in the kind of work I've ended up doing, and especially for his emphasis on integrating evolutionary approaches with the concept of nonviolence and of peace as major roles as well as conflict in human evolution. Today he is going to talk to us about the EEA rough and tumble play and the selection of restraint in human aggression. Douglas Fry.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm probably still a little red from listening to it, the face. And I also want to thank all members of the committee here and book editors for inviting me to participate, especially you, Darcia. It's really a wonderful symposium that is going on. I think we all agree on that, and I'm just really delighted and happy to be a part of it. So without further ado, I guess I better get going here because my style is to try to present a lot of slides, too many slides. And at the same time, I will try my best to end on time, and if not, you'll throw me out anyway. So, I'm going to start by just introducing several propositions that we'll play with here today. The first one is that the human EEA was a lot less violent than many people presume. And related to this, natural selection, I will argue, has favored restraint in human aggression. Also related to this, intraspecific killing has been selected against. So those are the three major propositions that we'll be dealing with in the talk. And the basis of these propositions, in other words, what type of evidence and arguments will we consider? First of all, I'm going to look at animal aggression and the evolutionary models or evolutionary interpretations of aggression within species aggression in the animal kingdom. And secondly, very relevant to thinking about the EEA, we'll consider nomadic hunter-gatherers and consider them as an analogy for recreating our past. And thirdly, rough and tumble play, something that we've just heard an excellent and interesting talk on by Joe Flanders. You'll see a lot of connections, actually, between what you've just heard from him and what I'll go through in the last third of my presentation. The relevance here, as you see in point 3, is rough and tumble play as a way of learning restraint. That's sort of a new angle, I thought, but Joe was already setting me up for this one nicely. Okay, so the overall plan of this presentation, my professors always used to say, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So here I am telling you what I'm going to tell you, in case that helps. Nomadic forager analogy comes first, followed by 3 types of selection pressure that would favor non-killing or favor restraint in human aggression. And then we'll consider rough and tumble play in the last third of the talk. For most of their evolutionary past, humans have lived as nomadic foragers. I think we've seen that clearly starting with Darcia's film clip and comments on the first day. Therefore, the best societies to examine with the goal of gaining insights about the EEA are extant nomadic foragers. Now here comes an important point just relevant to what Jim was talking about, Jim McKenna earlier, when he was referring to Bowlby using the coon, also known as the Zuntuasi, as a model. My approach is a bit different because I'm looking for recurring patterns as I look at hunter-gatherers. And if there are features that recur across almost all, or in some cases all of these societies, then I think we can reach a pretty good conclusion that it's very likely that the same patterns would have occurred going back in time as well. And especially we're considering societies that are living in different habitats, different ecological areas, and so forth. Here are just some visuals, examples from Australia. Africa and the Arctic, give you a taste of what hunter-gatherers look like and what they do. We'll have a few visuals as we go here. So just a few generalizations real quick. Nomadic hunter-gatherers live in bands whose composition varies as people transfer regularly. So these bands are constantly in a state of flux as people come and go and are reforming. One implication, well, they have very few material possessions also. Are politically egalitarian. Some people have even referred to them as being fiercely egalitarian. They tend to be widely dispersed across the land, low population densities, spread out. Lacking authoritative leadership, nomadic band societies nonetheless manage to deal with much conflict through avoidance, discussion, group meetings, contests. We'll consider contests in some detail here. Ostracism, and a variety of other nonviolent or at least aggression-limiting, aggression-reducing types of ways. Here's one example. Palayan of India generally separate if there's a conflict. They don't like conflict. So if there's a dispute within a band, one party will just take off and go elsewhere for a week or two. Palayan also have a dispute resolution assembly, which basically involves mediators to help them deal with their disputes. That's called a kutam. And finally, I'll just emphasize about them, they have a strong ethos of nonviolence. This is my good time as any to point out, I'll use my arms to symbolize this, I don't have a slide for it, but we can look at the hunter-gatherers as having some that are very nonviolent, extremely nonviolent, others a little bit more aggressive and so on, until we end up with ones that are periodically engaging in fights and homicides and so forth. But even though we have this continuum, these ones that are the most aggressive are not so horribly aggressive either. There's many more cultures that are much more aggressive as a generalization than hunter-gatherers. Grabbing the wrong thing here. I'm not going to click with the mouse. That just won't work, will it? Okay, here's a scene from John Marshall's film, The Meat Fight. Narcia has it nicely. She showed us a couple of clips from John Marshall, or one clip from John Marshall's film. But here in this scene, even though it's called The Meat Fight, there was no physical aggression. They managed to work this out totally by talking, and also in reference to the rules, the social rules of how meat should be distributed. We can work this out peacefully, as you hopefully can read here in the first slide. Continuing on how nomadic foragers handle conflict, disputes tend to be personal, such as between two men over infidelity, adultery, or competing over the same woman. Also, there can be various insults or slights of various types. The most common reason for homicides are over a woman or some sort of sexual jealousy or a revenge killing due to the death of a close family member. Another reason for homicide in these nomadic band societies is that band members do not tolerate, they do not like, overly aggressive individuals. And the best way to get yourself killed, if you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, is to become a recidivist killer. You will be executed or ostracized, and sometimes ostracism results in death anyway. But I want to emphasize that some of these societies, such as the Palayan that we just examined here for a moment, do not really engage in homicide. Out of seven out of 21 of these nomadic bands, which exist in a cross-cultural sample called the standard cross-cultural sample, ethnographers assessed homicides to be uncommon. In 3 of the societies, they used the word rare. One society, very rare. Another, never mentioned to occur. None known, and unknown. So this is 1/3 of the sample of 21, giving you an idea about the paucity of homicides in about 1/3 of these groups, as described by the ethnographers. Here's an example that sort of makes the point. For the Semang, murder, theft, and drunkenness are unknown crimes. The Semang is not aggressive or cruel, but to the contrary, very shy and timid towards strangers. We're going to consider warfare or the lack thereof shortly, but notice towards the strangers part. Semang do not engage in feud, they do not war, and they're very internally peaceful as well. So how do nomadic foragers handle conflicts? Uh-oh. My screen went blank. Tech person, maybe you could get my screen back at your leisure, but meanwhile we have a main screen here, and that's the most important things. So most disputes in any nomadic forager society are handled without violence. Thank you. Good tech person. A typical response to conflict within a band is for one party simply to leave the group. We've alluded to this. And ethnography after ethnography refers to hunter-gatherers as voting with their feet. It's very easy if you think about it, if you're nomadic, to just pack up and leave. In fact, you don't even have to pack up much because you don't have much. So easy. So just to give a little bit of a summary here with a different format, and notice here's a baby and a mother. Fits into the theme very well of the symposium. Disputes tend to be personal. Typically, two men are engaged in some sort of conflict over a woman. The reverse happens as well, where two women are engaged in a conflict with each other over a man. There are, of course, couple disputes involving infidelity, jealousy, or various other interpersonal issues, and then just the wastebasket category of saying injuries and insults of various types. But the theme really is that sexuality is a big cause for conflict, to a lesser degree food. The bottom one here, harming or killing of a family member and feeling resentment and wanting to take revenge, is a big issue for these societies that are not here on this nonviolent end of the scale anyway. And we're going to come back to that, so I'll just mention it at this point. Nomadic foragers are not warlike. They don't have militaristic values, that's for sure. After spending much of his career studying nomadic foragers, Julian Stewart explains that warfare is almost non-existent among nomadic hunter-gatherers for a variety of reasons. This is not exactly Stewart's chart, but he mentioned some of these things. I've added a few more. Just to consider that there's a lack of leaders with the authority to command others to go to war, so to speak. Band membership is flexible and in flux, as I mentioned. So what this means is it's a little hard to have groups permanently in some sort of conflict with each other because their composition is shifting. But even more important than that, these different bands out there across the environment have family members, exchange members, friends scattered out across the landscape. So it's very difficult with this type of social organization to get one group of the moment to have some sort of dispute with another group of the moment because there's all these interconnections. The low population density also keeps people spread out, and the nomadism allows people to just walk away from conflict easily. Value systems are also important here. As a pattern, and again we're looking at patterns, egalitarianism is definitely favored over any type of hierarchy, individual autonomy over taking or giving orders, cooperation sharing over militarism, hoarding or dominating, and then there is finally a lack of things to plunder. They don't store food, they don't have material resources, so, what is the point? That sort of removes that issue. And I'll add to the list, it's not on the list, but recall that these disputes are very personal, often two men fighting over a woman. It's hard to get a war going over that type of scenario. Kelly, archaeologist who's written on hunter-gatherers, studied them extensively, goes along with this type of interpretation. He writes that simple hunter-gatherer entails small, peaceful, my emphasis, peaceful nomadic bands, men and women with few possessions that are equal in wealth, opportunity, and status. Another quotation, this time from Eric Wolf. Among some human groups, organized conflict between groups is absent or rare. And he's specifically talking about some examples of nomadic hunter-gatherers. When he continues to survive, a person periodically needs to gain access to resources in other locations. And he gains such access through ties of kinship, marriage, friendship, and exchange. So again, picture a landscape of small bands, changing composition, spread out over a large area. You need the friends over there. Bob Tokenson, who studied Mardu in Australia, live in a very arid environment, points out that these people really need each other, and they know they need each other, because one year there'll be sufficient rainfall in this area, but next year no, and the rainfall will be over there. So in times of scarcity for food and water, these Mardu bands have to traverse large areas of space and go to where the resources are. It would be suicidal to try to keep other people out. And again, Wolf's point, they're connected by kinship, marriage, friendship, and exchange. That just helps to keep things peaceful. Using this standard cross-cultural sample, I took a look at all of the hunter-gatherers, and when I say all of the hunter-gatherers, we now include other hunter-gatherers, which are complex hunter-gatherers and also equestrian or horse-riding bands. These are two different types from the nomadic hunter-gatherers that I'm talking about today, and if you look at the simple cells here in the 2x2 table, you notice that there are a majority of the nomadic hunter-gatherers being non-warring, but virtually all, not virtually, I'll just say all of the other types of hunter-gatherers, the complex ones and the horse-riding bands, engaged in warfare. So that's an interesting pattern. Here's the same table, but without the culture names, just with the numbers and the probability. It's highly significant. As a little aside, somebody showed a picture of the Blackfoot. Blackfoot are equestrian hunter-gatherers, just as a footnote there. They do engage in war. They raided for horses and so on and so forth. But if we want a type of society to use as the best model for the EAA, obviously we don't want horse-riding hunter-gatherers and we don't want complex hunter-gatherers, and I won't go into what complex hunter-gatherers are at the moment, but maybe in discussion if anybody's interested. Here's a statement about the Batak of Malaysia, which I really like because it just shows how their way of thinking is so much different from ours about warfare and killing human people and so forth. The Batak abhor interpersonal violence and have generally fled from their enemies rather than fighting back. I once asked a Batak man why their ancestors had not shot Malay slave raiders who plagued them until about the 1920s with their poisoned blowpipe darts. His shocked answer, because it would kill them. So when I say non-war values, I think you see what I'm getting at here. Overall plan of the presentation. This is to remind us where we are, at least remind me where I am. We've been considering the first one. Now let's go on and consider three types of selection pressures which are against interspecific killing in humans. And here are the three types of areas we're going to go to. First of all, there are evolutionary costs and benefits to aggression. And if you look across the animal species, you'll see that the overall pattern is to show restraint, not to show all-out fighting. Secondly, we'll consider inclusive fitness as a selection pressure against killing in humans, as well as in other species. And thirdly, I'd like to point out what I view as a uniquely human selection pressure. At least this is what I'm proposing. And that is the human tendency to engage in revenge homicide, which we do see in some of these nomadic bands. So we'll come to these in sequence, doing the first one first. That's why it's in italics. Aggression obviously can have costs as well as benefits. And some of the costs of aggression would include the danger of physical injury, being killed as you engage in the aggression, harming your own kin if you're fighting with relatives, losing friends or supporters by damaging relationships that are important to you, the costs in terms of time and energy that the aggression takes you away from finding food or finding mates and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there are benefits, otherwise there would not be aggression existing in the animal kingdom. Benefits include obtaining food, territory, mates, safeguarding one's offspring as well as one's own life under certain circumstances, achieving and maintaining dominance if you're in a social hierarchy, which in turn can correlate, of course, with resources and mates. The overall conclusion is that aggression can be risky, but that it can be beneficial to an individual's fitness under certain circumstances. Natural selection can be seen as shaping the aggressive behavior of a species over many generations to maximize fitness benefits and to minimize the costs. And in bold and italics here, this principle applies not only to other species but also to humans. Why would it not? Most intraspecific aggression in the animal world is non-lethal. That's pretty clear. There are a few noted exceptions to this type of thing, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Just the overall generalization supported by many studies is that conspecifics tend not to kill conspecifics. Bernstein points out that the potential costs of fighting are such that natural selection has favored individuals that avoid taking risks when the cost of themselves is likely to exceed the benefits of anything obtained by engaging in that interaction. Animal aggression rarely involves total war, as Maynard Smith and Price call it, and to continue their quote, but instead, intraspecific conflicts are usually of a limited war type, involving insufficient weapons or ritualized tactics that seldom cause serious injury to either contestant. Natural selection seems to have favored individuals which follow the rules, is another way of putting this, follow the rules of ritualized fighting, so that, I guess I'm getting over here, no? Follow the rules of ritualized fighting so as not to expend unnecessary energy or to increase the risks of engaging in the aggression. So there are two ways here that we'll consider just briefly with a couple of animal examples. One thing that animals generally do is they use non-contact displays, and it's rather difficult to become injured if you're not engaging in any physical contact. Side-blotched lizards, for example, do push-ups. I won't try to demonstrate that. Use your imaginations. Male tarantula hawk wasps, that's a mouthful, engage in aerial displays. In their type of display, the wasps will fly up parallel to each other many meters up into the forest and then plunge down back to earth and just repeat this process over and over. Eventually one gets burned out, literally runs out of energy and concedes. All done with display, no contact, obviously minimal risk of injury under this situation. But there's another way that animals minimize the risk, and that's by engaging in tournaments. You're not showing me that, are you?
I am. That's 5 minutes to 30 minutes, and then there's 15.
Okay, we got our systems. You freaked me out there. 5 minutes to 30 minutes.
Thanks for looking.
That's sort of like I have 20 minutes left in theory, then?
That's it, though. I mean, then we go on.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. So contests. Ritualized aggression. This also can reduce serious injuries. Here's just an example from giraffes. They batter each other with their heads and necks, not causing serious injuries for the most part until one giraffe gives up. Restrained non-lethal aggression, in contrast to more risky escalated combat, has evolved as the predominant pattern in many species. Natural selection favors non-lethality towards conspecifics. I think you're getting the point here. And just to drive it in, I've labeled a slide conclusion, at least for this part. The prevalence in the animal kingdom of displays instead of contact aggression and ritualized contests instead of total war suggests that restraint is more successful as an evolutionary strategy than engaging in unbridled aggression. Now we go on to hunter-gatherers, the interesting part here. There are examples of non-contact displays among hunter-gatherers. For example, individuals may deliver purely verbal harangues as they're sitting around a campfire at night, and song duels is another interesting one that some Inuit groups engage in. As some generalizations about nomadic hunter-gatherer contests, they're fairly common. They don't occur in all nomadic foraging groups, however. The typical pattern of contests in nomadic forager societies involves wrestling. Contests vary in intensity from one group to the next. And as I said, not all of these groups have them. For instance, if it's a highly nonviolent culture like the Palion, who we considered earlier, or the Semai, they just don't engage in this type of rough behavior. The Ona foragers of South America wrestled to resolve disputes. These are just some ethnographic examples. The slave and dogwood bands, also of North America, had the custom of allowing one man to take another man's wife by out-wrestling the husband. The Ingalik, also from North America, practiced a similar custom. Siriono wrestle from South America, Nesilik, take turns back and forth, striking each other on the shoulder. They just stand facing each other. Wham, shoulder or head, back and forth until somebody gives up. These are examples of contests. So as among various animal species, these human contests have rules that limit aggression and allow for the resolution of differences with less risk of injury than might occur during less restrained forms of fighting. Spectators sometimes take a role in enforcing the rules. Contests are simultaneously serious, yet not dangerous, or at least not as dangerous as unbridled, no-holds-barred type of aggression. I say serious because keep in mind that there's dominance at stake here, and sometimes the two men are fighting over a woman. So winner gets the woman. That's a serious contest. Okay, let's consider inclusive fitness as a second type of selection force here. Hamilton's idea is basically that you share alleles. We all share alleles with our relatives, so we should treat them well. Therefore, when an individual protects and cares for close relatives, the individual is thereby simultaneously increasing the relative's chance of survival and simultaneously his or her own fitness. That's the idea in a nutshell. But turning this, touch the screen, I learned. Helping relatives is thought to be such normal and natural human behavior that it's usually just taken for granted. And Marshall Solins reminds us that kindness and kindred have the same derivation in English, which is sort of interesting. Here are some examples if we just think about kindness and kinship going together in hunter-gatherer groups. Based on the ethnographic accounts, it's clear that hunter-gatherers are interacting a large percentage of their daily lives with their relatives. That's a bit different from the way we live our lives. We obviously are interacting with relatives, but we interact with a whole lot of non-relatives. That's not typical of the EEA by any means. Marlowe, for example, explains that most persons within a Hadza camp are related with a group of sisters, interestingly, often forming the core network of relationships within the band. So again, when a person cooperates and shares and is good to relatives, it's enhancing that person's inclusive fitness. On the other hand, killing or injuring a relative has the opposite effect, and we would therefore suspect or expect that this type of behavior, killing, being overly aggressive, would be selected against. As the Gileacs say, brothers should not fight brothers. Turning now to this third principle as to why we would expect killing not to have been selected in the EEA, a few thoughts about reciprocity. Charles Darwin, in Descent of Man, called reciprocity the foundation stone of morality. And here's a short quote from Darwin. "The social instincts naturally lead to a golden rule. As ye would that men should do to you, do ye to them likewise. And this lies at the foundation of morality." It sort of sounds vaguely familiar, doesn't it? Like Darwin, Edward Westermarck gave reciprocity a central position in his theorizing, and interestingly, Westermarck emphasized the emotional aspect of this. He said the important thing is how people feel, and we either feel kindly towards people who have done kind deeds for us, he called this retributive kindly emotions, or we feel resentment when someone has done us a bad turn. There's a picture of Westermarck in Morocco with his Moroccan field guides and informants. The positive side of the reciprocity principle dominates within nomadic band societies, and hence we see a great deal of cooperation, sharing, helping, and so forth. Here's just one example from the Zuntuasi. A person one shares with will share in turn when he gets meat, and the people are sustained by a web of mutual obligation. That's just so nomadic forager. Here's some pictures of Zuntuasi actually making poison arrows, which they'll use in hunting. And on the picture on the right, they're at the water hole filling ostrich eggs. I always wonder how many you could feed with one ostrich egg, what type of omelet you could make with that, but I guess they know. Based on studies of extant nomadic foragers, it can be hypothesized that another powerful selection force favoring restrained, non-lethal forms of aggression in the AAA has resulted from the tendency for family members of a murder victim to avenge the death of their relative by killing the killer. I'll say that again, by killing the killer. That is the pattern among the nomadic foragers. So again, keeping in mind that some are non-violent and tend not to have homicide in a significant degree, those that do, this is the pattern. A close family member of the homicide victim targets the actual killer, usually, or a close family member of that killer. The revenge killing usually ends the matter because each family has then lost a member, and in this term of simple justice, an eye for an eye. The balance is restored. The killer was the only target or the preferred target in 11 out of 17 of the nomadic band societies in the standard cross-cultural sample where there was information on this fact. Here's some ethnographic examples which I think bring the point home. The Micmac believed that if thou killest, thou shalt be killed. The Chukchi of Siberia, a murder rarely remains unavenged. In the words of a Zuntuasi man, also reflecting this reciprocity principle of revenge, I want to hunt eland, kudu, and gemsbok, but hunting men is what gets you killed. Montagnier Naskapi of Canada traditionally believed that the appropriate response to a homicide was the execution of the killer by a member of the family. And finally, the Yukagir of Siberia had similar beliefs. The important implication is that by perpetrating a homicide within a nomadic forager society, a killer may be signing his own death warrant to be executed at the hands of the victim's family. Given that nomadic band social organization is the type of social organization in the EEA, this additional selective force favoring restrained aggression instead of killing may have been very significant. That's basically my new contribution here to thinking about selection forces against killing. I know I'm running a little short of time. You haven't flashed anything at me yet, but you will soon. So let's get on to rough and tumble. First of all, it certainly, as we've heard, was a feature of the EEA. This assertion is based on observations that rough and tumble is very common throughout the animal kingdom. It's ubiquitous among primate species, and it's also widespread among humans, probably universal in humans. Here are just some features. I won't read them all due to lack of time, but across mammals, threats are absent or infrequent, movements are free and easy, muscle tone is relaxed, biting is inhibited, and there are play signals, which is interesting. Play mimics aggression, but clearly animals and humans can differentiate play from real aggression. In humans, the pattern is that there is restrained wrestling, grappling, hitting, as well as chasing and fleeing. We saw a lot of little chasing and fleeing among the rats in the wonderful video clip we saw this morning. In young children, R&T and aggression are distinct. A couple of Zapotec kids there showing clear play faces. The observation that rough and tumble is widely, probably universally distributed across human societies, and that boys tend to engage in more frequent and more vigorous rough and tumble than do girls, along with research about age differences, which we'll consider shortly, this all leads to a conclusion or an inference that rough and tumble serve certain adaptive functions. The preliminary evidence suggests that the practice of fighting skills and the establishment of dominance are probable evolutionary functions for rough and tumble. Specifically, the importance of rough and tumble in practice seems to function in young children, where there's a clear difference between aggression and rough and tumble. But as you get into the pre-adolescent and the adolescent years, dominance features seem to come into place. And this is based on some research by other researchers. But I'll just add that when I was doing Zapotec research, I observed young children and saw play and aggression as very distinct. But on a few incidences, which are not really part of my study, when I saw teenagers engaging in R&T, it was interesting how it seemed to grade sometimes to serious aggression for a minute and back again. One example of this is when a boy gave a push to another boy as he was sitting on the wall, and the boy on the wall tumbled over backwards, literally landing on his head. And he was not happy with that. It was intended as just a playful thing, so it ensued a huge chase flee for many minutes as the guy chasing alternated his expression between anger and then play, and then anger and then play. Finally, the one being chased allowed himself to be caught and receive a punch, sort of a payback. There's the reciprocity principle again. But this is what I'm talking about when you get a dominance feature and a grading back and forth with older ages. It needs to be researched more, certainly. One lesson learned in rough and tumble in animals is that of restraint. Bernstein points out, monkeys reared in social isolation seem to lack the social skills required to assess the willingness of a rival to engage in escalated aggression, the ability of the rival to inflict aggressive costs, and even the meaning of signals that the rival uses when conceding access to a contested resource. And we've seen this already in this symposium with your talk and with the talk this morning by Joe Flanders. Just if we think back about the mammalian pattern, here's some indicators of play that I think clearly show that restraint is being shown during rough and tumble. The biting is inhibited, the roles reverse back and forth, dominance relations are relaxed for the young kids. Again, individuals of different sizes or partners, that certainly fits with fathers playing with kids. Larger and stronger individuals self-handicap. If we refer to Joe Flanders' first video where they're speaking French, recall how at the end of that little clip, the father actually pulls the son onto him, and the son starts counting as if he's the winner. That's a definite example of restraint on the father's part, obviously, self-handicapping, and letting the son be the victor. But by adolescence, rough and tumble participants seem to be well aware that play and aggression are not as distinct phenomena as they were in the younger years. The shared understanding of rough and tumble play, I would argue, among young children is this is only play, it's not real aggression. However, by adolescence, we get a shifting of understanding. We both know that this has a serious component, but we implicitly agree to pretend that it does not. The intermingling of play and aggression among adolescents has parallel, I am proposing, in the contests of nomadic foragers. Contests, as adolescent R&T, can involve dominant struggles while allowing for the resolution of differences with less injury than might occur during real aggression. Contests, like adolescent R&T, have features that straddle play and aggression. Contests have rules that promote restraint, and spectators of the contest take a role in enforcing these rules. In other words, contests are simultaneously serious yet not serious, or serious yet not as dangerous as escalated aggression. Contests directly parallel the rough and tumble of adolescence, and both types of interaction may grade back and forth between play and aggression in this gray area of exercising restraint and simultaneously seeking to dominate an opponent. I'm going to jump ahead to the conclusions out of respect for keeping the time here. I should do this slide, though. It can be hypothesized that rough and tumble not only contributes to the learning and practice of fighting skills, but more broadly to experience at handling agonistic interactions with restraint, such as developing an understanding about when not to fight at all, how to fight by the rules within a particular social context, when and how to signal submission, and how to respond with de-escalation to an opponent who wants to give up. Again, I think if you think what we've been hearing this morning by Joe Flanders, there are parallels here in terms of learning how to do this correctly. So in terms of conclusions, we considered these three proposals, that the human EEA was a lot less violent than presumed, and I've argued that natural selection has favored restraint, and more specifically, acted against interspecific killing. I've also pointed out that nomadic foragers present a good model, perhaps the best model, for understanding the EEA if you look at the typical and recurring patterns that you see with these societies. We've considered that evolutionary perspectives in the animal kingdom, also forager data, and real quickly, I apologize for this with whirlwind speed, some thoughts about rough and tumble and how that relates to restraint as well, but it's all part of the package as to what are the adaptive values of aggression and play and how they interconnect, also involving dominance. So we've seen that disputes are personal among nomadic foragers, and most disputes are not lethal. Individual disputes between two men over a woman are rather typical. Homicides are rare in some forager societies, but more likely in others. The most common reasons for homicide are revenge for a previous killing, or some sort of sexual adultery infidelity issue. Aggression can be dangerous, and it can be socially harmful. Aside from physical injury, repeated or extreme aggression can lead to ostracism and execution. So restraint is an evolutionary sensible, and restraint is evolutionary sensible and is apparent in the way that nomadic foragers deal with their conflicts. So this is just real quick, these three reasons as to why we would expect restraint. As in many other species, human males have been selected to use restraint in aggression, and use restraint in aggression can be hypothesized that it's learned and practiced as children, especially males, engage in rough and tumble play. So thank you very much. I'll end here, more or less on time.
We have a couple minutes for maybe one or two questions.
That was a great summary. Kind kind of hesitate to accept that rough and tumble play in females is not present, or that it is less than in males.
Oh, well, that's not a matter of accepting, and I apologize for not having time to run through the studies.
Let me finish the data I was going to highlight.
Well, gosh, I was just going to give you the data.
Well,
I mean, I've looked at this very carefully. Virtually every study shows males engaging in more rough and tumble than females for humans.
I realize.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. I'll let you say your question first.
The point is that you can run controlled experiments in rats. And when we did that, and you literally see every moment of play, the gender difference that is very robust in rats appears to be learned. We also did the first rough and tumble play in a laboratory ethological setting where we brought in a pair of boys and a pair of girls, 10 pairs of each. They were friends, so they got past knowing each other, and they were allowed to play just in their, friendly, like-sex pairs, and we monitored 19 ethological measures of play, and there were no gender differences. Now, absence of an effect doesn't mean there isn't an effect, but that is the best controlled study. In the real world, there are dramatic differences, but if, in fact, constitutionally, there are no differences, then we as a society, if we're going to use play, I think we have to recognize that the urge for this kind of play in females is just as strong, but cultural learning rapidly produces a gender effect, and what we do with that, is open for discussion.
Yes, and let me not overstate it. I certainly agree that girls do rough and tumble play, and they seem to enjoy it just like boys. But if we look across a whole variety of studies, I don't know of any meta-analysis that actually has been done on this topic.
That's learning.
Maybe you do.
It's important to distinguish learning and what Mother Nature gave us as potentials. And it's awfully important to remember that.
Yes. At the same time, if you just start counting up the studies done, in a variety of different countries, mostly UK and US, but also including my Zapotec work, and a few other places around the planet, like Mel Connor's work and Zuntwasi and so forth.
That's why
you do see an overall pattern where the boys tend to do it more. There's no studies that I know of that show that girls rough and tumble more than boys. There are studies like yours that show no difference, but most studies show that there's a sex difference.
So I agree with the facts, but the interpretation of the facts is the important issue I'm trying to raise, that even though that's what appears in our culture, and many things appear in our culture, the question a scientist always has to ask, where are the sources of variance? Are they in biology or are they in culture? In this one, I believe the source of variance is in the culture and not the biology.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment. I guess we'll have to duke that one out later over a beer or something.
One more comment over here. One more.
I just have a quick question about if you have any observations from your research on parenting practices that could also give some background to these nonviolent cultures. Thank you.
Yes, the nonviolent parents tend to treat the kids in a nonviolent way. First of all, they're not acting aggressively in their daily lives. So in a very nonviolent type of society, you don't see husbands beating wives, wives beating husbands, very little physical punishment for the most part. You just are providing an environment where the kids don't see aggression. Very little kids, of course, will engage in temper tantrums and maybe make a fist like this and come down. They're either removed or ignored. In any case, it becomes clear to kids as they're growing up that this is not accepted. Semai is not a culture that I use as a hunter-gatherer culture because they engage in some horticulture as well, but they live in bands and are rather similar to hunter-gatherers. And the reason I mention them is that I've been in personal communication with two anthropologists who worked with them, and Bob Denton, one of them, describes how Semai kids, when they rough and tumble or play fight, will take sticks and swing at each other but never hit each other, or they will grab each other and try to push each other over but never actually succeed. So it's a very subdued, refined type of play fighting, even in that culture, which I guess comes back to your point about the learning element to these things, certainly. So the nonviolent cultures perpetuate it through socialization, certainly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Can I raise a question? Just a quick
Well, I
one.
think we have to wait. Well, we can do it at the discussion later. Sorry. Let's go on. I'm sorry. Everyone's mad at me now. All right. Our next speaker will be introduced by James McKenna. Let's give him applause while we... Thank you.